Welcome to the world of watercolor, where creativity flows and mistakes turn into masterpieces. If you're a watercolor newbie and just not sure where to start, don't worry, you're in the right place. Hi, I'm Emily Olson, and today we're diving into 9 simple watercolor exercises that are perfect for absolute beginners. Whether you're just starting out or want to add more tricks to your painting toolbox, these techniques will help you create beautiful, vibrant art with ease. And the best part, you don't need fancy supplies or years of experience. Just grab the brushes, paints, and paper you have. I'll guide you through every step of the way. Make sure to paint along with me. This isn't just a tutorial, it's a hands-on experience. By the end of this video, you'll have a collection of fun, creative techniques under your belt that you can use to start your next masterpiece. So are you ready? Let's dive in and make something beautiful together. Before you start, make sure you're set up in a comfortable space and that you have your watercolor paints ready to go. You'll need an assortment of colors, but you don't have to choose the same colors I use. Just use colors that you enjoy and that you have. Make sure you have a water jar or 2. I like to have 2, one for rinsing my dirty brush and one for clean washes. Paper towel or a rag. And today it'll be helpful to have 2 watercolor brushes so that you can easily switch back and forth between colors. This is a silver black velvet size 8 round brush, which is a combination of synthetic and natural fibers. And this is a Kolinsky Sable Rosemary and Company size 8 round brush. Your paper is going to be your most important supply. So for best results, use 100% cotton watercolor paper. This is a Sennelier block. You can see it's 100% cotton, 140 pound, 11 4/5 inches. So it's almost a 12 by 12 inch block with 20 sheets. Now a block is simply paper that has been glued down on the sides, except for one little slot where you can easily remove the paper when you're done with your painting. This keeps your paper flat the entire time you're working, especially when you're using lots of wet washes. It's really helpful so you don't have to worry about your paper warping and buckling. If you are working with a single sheet of paper, you can go ahead and tape down the sides, and that'll also help keep your paper secure. I've used Blick 1/4 inch painter's tape to map out 9 equal squares on my paper. If you're working with more of a rectangular shaped surface, that's totally okay too. Just make them rectangle shapes. All we need are 9 segments blocked out for these exercises today. It's going to be a lot of fun. You're going to get to practice all of these different ways to work with your watercolors to achieve really beautiful results. So I'm excited. I hope you are too. Let's start with the first one. Exercise number 1 is called a flat wash on dry paper. So we're going to start up here on the top left corner. Choose any color you'd like. I'm going to use my turquoise blue. This is a Holbein color because it's so beautiful. Now the key to a flat wash on dry paper is mixing up enough paint on your palette to cover the entire area without having to mix more. Watercolor is the only medium that relies solely on timing for so many different effects. And that's why we have to make sure we have enough paint ready to go. If you stop anywhere in the middle of your flat wash to mix more paint, something's going to dry and leave a hard edge. So we want a nice seamless flat wash with it all the way across, no bumps or breaks or splotches anywhere in the wash. So to achieve that, we need to have lots of paint ready to go. So what I'm doing is mixing up a milky consistency of paint. You can see when I swirl it around, there's quite a lot of pigment in there, but enough water so that it really flows well. I'm going to tilt my board slightly upright so that I have gravity working in my favor. And I'm going to start with my brush tilted at about a 45-degree angle like this, so that the tip is constantly pointed down. What we want is to leave a bead, a wet bead along the edge as we work our way across. So I'm just going left to right, grabbing hold of that wet bead and continuing the paint all the way across, grabbing more as needed. And you can see as I hold it up like that, the paint just kind of bubbles at the very end. It beads up at the very bottom of my wash. And I'm just going to continue to take that wash, that bead, and pull it downward. You have to work quickly for the best effect. Now I'm going to end up with a little bit of excess water at the bottom. I can't leave it there, or else I will end up with something called a bloom or a backwash. So I'll show you in a second. When I get to the very bottom of my wash, I'm going to set it down, dry my brush, and then gently soak up the excess paint at the bottom of the wash right there. This is going to prevent that really wet paint from moving back up into the wash and creating a backwash. So we'll rinse that out, let it dry all the way. And you can see we got a really beautiful, nice, even wash, wet on dry. The next one is also a flat wash, but this time we're going to pre-wet the paper. So this is wet on wet. The advantage to using this technique versus on dry paper is that you actually have more time to apply pigment without worrying about something drying on the way. So I really like this technique for skies, especially when I'm working outdoors, painting from life. It gives me a little bit more time to work. So let's begin with a wet surface. This is where you're going to want to have your extra water jar with clean water, and we'll have to change this one out as we work. But go ahead and make sure your brush is clean and paint your surface with clear water. The key to a nice, clean, wet on wet flat wash is making sure that your surface is glossy damp, no puddles or pooling, and no dry patches before you apply your paint. We're still going to work with a quick, even side-to-side motion of the brush when we apply our paint, but this way we have a little bit more breathing room. And you'll see that the paint is just going to spread out naturally and soften across the paper. It'll be really fun. So again, let's choose another color. Let's do something along the blue theme again. How about this time we'll do ultramarine blue, since this is the color I use for the skies all the time anyway. This time I'm pulling paint pretty much directly from the palette, and I want a slightly thicker consistency than I had for my wet and dry flat wash. That's because I already have plenty of water on the paper surface. And so you can see as soon as I apply the paint, look at that explosion that happens. Wherever you've applied water, your paint is going to flow. So continue to grab more paint. And you can see how easily it's just spreading across the paper. Also, you can see why I need thicker paint, less water in my brush. There's already plenty of water in the paper. I don't need to introduce any more with my brush. And so this is where a nice even balance of water in my brush versus water on the paper is essential. Now, if you end up with some unevenness, you have a little bit of time to work across that surface with your brush before it dries out completely. If it's still a little bit glossy, keep going over it. If you want it to be darker in one area or another, add more thick paint to that spot. You have a little bit of time, because we pre-wet the paper, to work the surface to get the effect that you want. So there it is. That's a wet on wet flat wash. The next exercise is called wet on wet on dry paper. Now you might be wondering, what in the world do I mean by that? Another word for this is wet next to wet, or charging colors on the dry paper. So we're going to need our two brushes, and we're going to choose two different colors to work with, preferably colors that are harmonious and blend well together. So I'm going to choose my warm yellow. This is Gamboge Nova. And for my second color, I'll be using my warm red Scarlet Lake. All right, so on one brush, load it up with one of your colors. We're going to have two puddles of paint over here. And once again, I want you to see what kind of consistency I'm working with. It's sort of a half and half consistency, not as thick as the paint I had putting on wet paper over here, because we're not going to pre-wet the surface. So it needs to be a little bit creamier, a little smoother, somewhere between milky and a half consistency. And on my second brush, I'm going to load that up with my yellow color. Trying not to spatter all over my paper. And also same milky / half and half consistency over here with my yellow. It's a good idea to start with your lighter color when you're doing washes like this, but it doesn't matter which one you start with in this case. We're going to be applying them on the dry paper side by side in some interesting shapes. So whatever shapes you come up with, there's no right or wrong way to do this. I want you to know that right off the bat. All right, so I'm going to start with some kind of splotches of yellow, cutting through the middle maybe. And I actually need it to be even more wet than that. Then switching quickly to my red color, I'm going to apply that on the dry paper. even more water right next to the yellow. You can see how fast I'm working, and there's a reason for this madness. Again, timing is everything. I want to encourage some bleeds to happen, and already we're seeing that a little bit here. The red is creeping into the yellow and creating an orange color as the two colors combine naturally on the paper. You don't have to fill in every little gap here. You can leave some of the white of the paper shining through, and that can look kind of cool. Sort of this patchwork of yellow, red, and then orange as it's seeping together right here. I'm going to take a little more of my yellow, just put it right along the side there. So as I said, there's no right or wrong way to do this. Just have fun with the colors on your paper. And that one again is called wet next to wet, or wet on wet with two colors on dry paper. If you're loving this video and feel ready to dive even deeper, whether you're just starting out or aiming to level up your skills, Watercolor Mastery has everything you need to grow and thrive. Our 30 Days to Watercolor program is perfect for beginners. It's your step-by-step guide to learning the basics and building your confidence. And once you've mastered that, the journey doesn't stop. With daily challenges released every weekday for an entire year, you'll never run out of inspiration. From fun mini projects to advanced techniques, you'll grow your skills one brushstroke at a time. Join a community of passionate artists and watch your creativity soar. Click the link below and start your watercolor journey today. All right, let's get back to the video. Our fourth exercise is wet next to wet, but on wet paper. So over here we worked on dry paper, and this time we're going to wet the surface, kind of like we did with our flat wash over here. So this time you'll get to see how the color just explodes a lot faster on the paper. This is a technique I use all the time for things like sunset skies, clouds, anywhere I have to have a soft blend of two or more colors. Wet on wet is going to be your best friend for that. So we're pre-wetting the surface. Again, you can see how it's just glossy wet. And I'm spreading out the water evenly so that there's no puddling or pooling. The key here is to make sure that your brush is not too wet. When you have an already wet surface, keep in mind there's some water there already, so don't make your brush too wet. It should be a creamier or thicker consistency than what we had here. Okay, so oh, looks like I splashed on my flat wash. Whoops. I'll show you how up close what happens when you splash on a flat wash. When a little bit of water gets on your flat wash, this is what happens. That's called a bloom. There's really nothing I can do about it now, but it's actually kind of good for you to see that. All right, so once again, double check the wetness of your paper here. I'm going to go over it one more time just in case. I want to make sure that it's soaked and ready to handle my paint. All right, again, it's up to you what colors you want to choose. This time, let's do something with green. I'm going to take Hooker's green, and notice how I'm just grabbing the paint directly from the palette so that it's super thick and creamy on my brush. And I'm going to do some swirls in my paper. And watch how that paint just spreads so beautifully. It just feathers out, or fuzzes out is another way to describe it. And you just never really know what's going to happen when you do this effect. That's what makes it so much fun. Now I'm going to take Hansa Yellow Light. This is my cool yellow. And I know I said normally you should start with your lighter color. But again, just grabbing paint directly from the palette. And I'm going to drop that in between my green. So we just have some shimmering yellow highlights happening in between those green swirls. So this almost looks like a blurry background in a photograph. In fact, you can even do more colors on top of this while it's still glossy like this. As soon as it starts to look matte, damp, don't touch it. But right now it's still glossy. So if you want to, you can even take something like indigo and add a vignette in the corner, you know, to darken it up, to make it even more of this kind of ethereal green spring background effect. While it's glossy, there's a lot of room to play. But the key here is brush wetness, not too wet. The dampness of your brush should match what's on the paper and not be any more wet than that. Otherwise, you'll end up with something like that. So that's intentional bleeds and color blends on wet paper. For the next one, we're going to do a single color gradient on dry. I'm trying to show you how each of these effects are possible, but they create different results depending on whether you wet the paper or leave it dry first. So it's just really amazing how many different varieties of techniques you can achieve with watercolor. I love it so much. So we're starting with dry paper, and that means our paint viscosity needs to be looser, wetter, and be able to flow across the dry surface easier. So that means less thick paint than what we did over here. Now, a gradient is when you work from dark to light or light to dark or anywhere in between. So let's do a single color gradient using a violet. We haven't dipped into any purples yet. This is Holbein Permanent Violet. And what I'm going to do is gradually work from dark to light. So I have to start with thicker paint for the darkest value. So sometimes it takes a little bit of time to scoop up the paint, scrub it out, especially if it's been dry in your palette for a while. That's why spraying it with a spray bottle ahead of time can help. But I want to just test it out here in my palette first and see how dark I can get it while still having a nice creamy, smooth consistency that will flow across the surface of the dry paper easily enough. So this is pretty good. I'm going to start with this very dark value. And you'll notice how it's sort of catching on the surface of the paper a little bit. So I have to, go quickly and smoothly and work my brush across side to side. Now I dip in the water, blob on the paper towel a little bit, and start to touch the edge of that damp, darker paint. And I'm actually going to tilt my board up a little bit too. Remember, you can use gravity to help you with this. Grab a little bit more water, and I have to work fast. See how my values are getting a little bit lighter now. Oops. The more water I add in, when I get to the bottom, I want to try to make it almost completely transparent. So I'm going to rinse my brush all the way out and just use clean water, touching the edge of that damp paint at the bottom and blending it out right there. All right, so I didn't get a very perfect gradient with this one. It's a little bit harder to do on dry paper just because you're working on dry paper and the timing is harder. So I'm going to show you how an easier way to do the gradient, and you've probably already guessed it, on a wet surface. So once again, let's get started with a wet surface with clean water. Right now I'm just working with my Kolinsky Sable brush, but either one works just fine. Don't need a second brush if I'm only working with one color. And you'll see how much easier it is to get a nice smooth gradient from light to dark or vice versa when you pre-wet the surface. So let's make this one move in the opposite direction. Instead of going dark to light, how about we start with dark at the bottom and move up lighter towards the top. And for the color for this one, let's use Quinacridone Rose. This is a Daniel Smith color. Gorgeous color. All right, again, it's essential to start with creamy paint for your darkest value, but already you can see the paint is beginning to fuzz out and spread naturally for us. And as you work, the paint will gradually wear off your brush, or you can use your paper towel to remove a little bit of it, but it's so much easier to get a lighter value as you work when the paper is already wet. Now I'm going to rinse most of it out and just kind of gently brush it up towards the top there. And now because the paper is still glossy, I can go over it again. This is the advantage to pre-wetting the paper. I can smooth out my horizontal lines a little bit more, try to make it more perfect. And you can see how much more natural looking that is than the wet and dry one. But of course it could just be my poor skills right there, I don't know. There's my favorite way to do a single color gradient on wet. You guys are doing great so far. We only have 3 left to do for this exercise. And of course, do these as many times as you want. And the more you do them, the easier they'll get. For this next one, we're going to do something called glazing. And this is going to take a couple of steps. So we'll start with step 1. We'll move on to the next one while that dries. And then we'll come back to it again. So glazing is when you apply a layer of paint over a dry layer of paint. Let's begin with a single color. I'm going to go back to yellow again. And I'm just going to go ahead and quickly paint a flat wet and dry wash. And I'm not doing this with the bead. I'm just kind of working, scrubbing all over it. When you have a small area, honestly, it's pretty easy to just do a flat wash like this, coloring it in quickly, just making sure that you don't have any excess water or puddling anywhere. And that is a nice flat yellow wash right there. So while that's drying, let's go on to the next one. And this one is going to be a 2-color gradient on wet. So for the next two, we're going to do gradients, which are multiple colors blended together, similar to what we did here and here. But we're going to start with a wet surface for both of these. Again, these are really useful for things like sunset skies. So let's use colors that are similar to what we would use in a sunset. I'm going to start by pre-wetting the paper again. You can see what my favorite technique is here. Wet and dry has its place, but most of the time I use that for finishing details. And for my favorite washes, I love to work with wet especially because I have so much more time to play, to soften, and to drop more color in. Okay, so we've got a glossy surface again. Let's choose 2 colors that are going to look beautiful together. How about we do marine blue? We'll start at the bottom for this one. And I want it to blend in the middle with another color that will work well with it. So for that second color, let's use another green here. This one is called Permanent Green number 1. And this green has a little more yellow in it, similar to the blue, which has a little more yellow in it. So these 2 colors will blend beautifully in the middle. And so let those colors touch, and you can even encourage a little bit of a softening with your brush right there. But don't mess with it too much. That's plenty. I'm going to leave that alone and let it dry. And then finally for our last one here, we're going to do a 3-color gradient. I need clean water again, so it's important to change out your water if it's dirty. And for this one, I want to simulate a sunset. So I'm going to have blue at the top, more of a pink towards the middle, and then I'm going to have that gradually move to yellow. So again, starting with clean water, painting with water across your paper for a glossy surface. You're going to hear me saying this over and over again. Don't allow puddles to happen. When puddles form, the paint will just sit there, and then as it begins to dry, the extra water may begin to seep into areas that are less wet, and that'll cause blooms. So for the most seamless flat washes, we want a seamless glossy surface. All right, so let's begin with our lightest color this time. Yellow at the bottom. Again, kind of picturing a sunset gradient right here. I'm going to move about 1/3 of the way up, maybe a little bit further. The next color is Quinacridone Rose. And I can let this touch the yellow just a little bit for a sort of orangey blend right there. And if I want it to be even darker, pull more paint from the palette. Rinse. And make sure all that pink is out, and then grab your next color. In this case, I'm going to be using Ultramarine. Now notice how quickly I'm working and mixing. I don't want to miss the timing here. Timing is essential. So Ultramarine blue, and then when I'm ready, I let it touch the pink. Forms this gorgeous purple right where the 2 colors combine. And if your yellow got a little bit too dull, feel free to apply some more. Just go over it again. Right there, and let it touch that pink. And there we've got a perfect replication of what you would see in a sunset gradient. So let's let these dry all the way, and then we're going to come back and finish our glazing square, and then we'll remove our tape and see how our exercises look completely dry. All right, our yellow square has dried enough that we can now do glazing over the top. Again, glazing is wet on dry over a dry layer of paint. This is used for the purpose of both darkening or adding details, but also changing the color. So for example, if I want my yellow to look a little less vibrant, I can use the opposite color on the color wheel to neutralize that tone. And that's why I left my purple puddle here. I'm going to use purple over the top, and you'll see how the purple changes as it's painted across the yellow. It looks more neutral. So let's just do some stripes across. And you can see the transformation in color. This doesn't really look purple. In fact, it looks kind of brown, doesn't it? This is a useful combination for sandy seashores. And we can do another cross this way. Now keep in mind that when you're glazing and you're working on a dry surface, the brush strokes that you put down are going to stay put exactly how you paint them. So we have really hard edges where the brush strokes are laid down, and it doesn't soften out at all, not like what you saw in these other wet on wet effects. So very, very useful if you want your brush strokes to stay put. So that's it. There's our last one. How'd you do? Let's remove our tape, revealing our pretty borders, separating all of these fun little exercises. There we go. 9 different ways you can do washes to create different effects in watercolor. I hope this was useful for you. Thank you so much for watching today, and I'll see you in the next video.